Hermeneutics is simply a reflection on when we think about something and we try to understand it, how are we interpreting it? And generally that means that we bring in our life history, our presuppositions and thoughts on many topics, and we interpret it the way we see it from our perspective. So this word hermeneutics is important when we interpret anything, another person or a text, a newspaper or a passage from the Bible. We understand it when we bring our ways of thinking on various things that have formed us as persons, and we read this text, and when we understand it for what it means for me, that means that I've really brought to bear all those presuppositions. If we don't have an awareness of these things that are impacting on how we understand it, the danger is that we think that my interpretation is the only possible interpretation. And so it's good to be aware that I have a hermeneutic that I'm bringing to bear on this text.
We'd use the world of the text as an approach to Scripture because Scripture is more than the words on the page. And so in order to interpret the words on the page, we need to know something about where it's come from, what those words might mean and be translated, and how it's been used today or how it's been interpreted in today's world. Hermeneutic is a way of looking at the text and examining the text. So the world behind the text would give you some context about culture and history. The world of the text would be looking at genre, and the world in front of the text would be looking at about how this text has been interpreted over time or how it might be used within the religious community at the time. The world behind the text is really important because the text is written in a certain time and place and by a single or multiple authors. So we need to try and find out as much as possible about this ancient text.
It's called historical critical method. We're trying to reconstruct the world at that time. So that's looking at the history, looking at the different archaeological evidence that could help us to understand that. For example, Jesus, as he toured around Galilee, and what was the social economic life at that time? So that sort of helps us to understand Jesus in his world.
The world of the text is about the words on the page and how the authors have constructed those words to shape us as readers. And so reading poetry is different from reading a recipe book. And we need to know when we're looking at a text whether it's poetry or not. If it's a parable, we need to know that there are certain ways that you create a parable, and it has a particular form, and it has usually 3 characters in it, and the punchline's at the end. So if we know that, we read it with a particular set of glasses on, and we can start to interpret it from that point of view. So it's about the words, and it's about the structure of how the text is put together.
And then there are a whole series of approaches that look at this set text, forgetting about the history behind it, and they look at the narrative structure. So this has got a fancy title called narrative criticism, and tries to see how the dynamics, it's like investigating any literary work, like, as I said, a Shakespearean play or a poem or something like that. So that's their literary approaches that take the text as it is.
For Catholics, the world in front of the text has probably only been explored in the last 10 to 20 years. Prior to this, we'd concentrated our energies on history and the words of the text, but the world in front of the text is equally as important because it helps us to interpret the text. We come to the text with 2,000 years of Christian interpretation, and so how that text has been used in church, how it might have been used in common parlance, will influence the way that we read and interpret the text. Feminist biblical scholars, for example, will give us new insight into how women may have been treated in the text. If we think of the second creation account, the story of Adam and Eve, as most people would call it, that has been preached about in churches for centuries as men are more important and more significant than women. The world in front of the text today gives us a whole new interpretation of that story, and by investigating contemporary biblical scholarship, we can interpret that text differently and more appropriately for today's audiences.
When we look at the world in front of the text 2,000 years later, or however down through the last 2 centuries, this is a whole world of methods in which we try to break open the meaning of this world. So these are called reception theories of approaches. That's saying, well, I'm reading this from my perspective. How can I receive this and interpret it and make meaning of it for me in my context?
We all bring who and what we are to all our interactions in life. So reading and interacting with a biblical text, we bring that to it as well. So as a female, I bring a particular interpretation to the text that is different from a male who may well be the same age as me. I will bring a different interpretation from someone who may be 20 or 30 years older than me. We all bring our interpretation, we all bring our scholarship, our life background, our experiences with the text. If we have had the experience of being a refugee, for example, we're going to read the Exodus story very differently from me, who's never had that experience. And that's about context and who we are. And in formal biblical scholarship, it's called reader response criticism. So with the world behind the text, it's multiple lenses on how the text operates. So we could spend all our time looking at how is this particular scripture story used today, but then we may not learn anything about who its original audience was. So we need to have all the worlds of the text together to give us a full picture. Now we may, in some teaching situations, have a stronger emphasis on the world behind the text, or if we're teaching parables, we might have a stronger emphasis for this particular lesson on the genre and what it looks like. But if we only teach from that perspective all the time, we're only getting one idea rather than multiple ideas about how this text fits within the bigger group of sacred texts. And sacred texts are more than words. They're about how it's been experienced and lived through generations. I think one of the other things about the world of the text is that often teachers don't know where to go to find the information. A good start are biblical commentaries. Sometimes we might find them a little intimidating in the detail that happens in a biblical commentary, but it's useful to do some general reading about the text itself first, and then to do some very focused and particular reading. And it's good to start with reliable resources and not just to Google.
Scripture is really the soul of what we do and the soul of our faith. It's important that teachers, adults and children have a good, strong foundation of what Scripture is saying to us. And our love of Scripture, our embrace of the stories, our embrace of the world of God and God's vision for the world and for us, that we have a firm foundation, firm understanding of what that is, and to truly enter into the world of Scripture.